So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants joining us today. Welcome to the launch webinar of the Disaster Displacement Addendum to the City Resilience Scorecard. My name is Marta Lindström, and I am Capacity Strengthening Coordinator with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and I will be your moderator for this session. We are delighted to have with us a wide array of participants from all across the globe, from local governments, international organizations, as well as practitioners working on disaster risk reduction and displacement. According to our registration data, we have participants joining us from all across the globe, ranging from Asia to Sub-Saharan Africa to Northern Africa to Southern and Central America and to Europe. We also have representatives from local governments, from the UN, from the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, from NGOs, and from donor organizations. But before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping points. First, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and all the relevant materials will be available after the session and easily accessible online. Also, this session is available in English, French, and Arabic, and please make sure to access the correct interpretation channel based on your need. In addition, it's also important that you adjust the volume of speaking in your interpretation channel so that you can properly hear the interpretation of your selected language. We do encourage your active participation throughout this webinar, and you are welcome to post any questions that you might have in the Q&A section. So we have a dedicated Q&A section for your questions, and if you post them in the chat as opposed to the Q&A section, we may not be able to follow them. But if you post them in the Q&A section, then later there are going to be dedicated QA segments of this webinar when we will be addressing your questions live, and the presenters will be addressing your questions. In addition, we will also be aiming to respond directly to questions in the Q&A function. Now, I'm sure you're curious to hear about the speakers who will guide us through today's session. For the introductory remarks, we will hear from Loretta Heber-Giardet, who is Chief of UNDRR's Risk Knowledge Monitoring and Capacity Development Branch, and who has shared a recorded message for us today. Then Carla Lienhardt, who is Program Support Officer at the Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Change Adaptation Unit at IOM's headquarters, will give you an overview of the tool and facilitation package for the Disaster Displacement Addendum. Then later in the session, we will hear from Lorenzo Guadagno from the Platform of Disaster Displacement, who will talk about lessons learned and next steps for rolling out the scorecard. We are also extremely pleased to have with us here today Anna Tucker-Abrahams, Senior Director of Mitigation, Planning and Research at the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management in Jamaica. She will be joining us to share experiences from the recent piloting of the scorecard in Jamaica, as well as her experience in developing Jamaica's resettlement strategy. We look forward to an engaging discussion today, and with that, let's get started. I will hand over for the introductory remarks from UNDRR.
Dear colleagues and participants, yes. I would like to extend to you a very warm welcome. It is my pleasure to be here on behalf of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction to introduce this very important new joint tool together with our close partners, the IOM, PDD, and IDMC. Displacement is one of the most common and immediate impacts of disasters, which pose serious humanitarian and development concerns. Climate change is further projected to increase disaster displacement globally through more frequent and intense extreme events, as well as slow onset processes globally, such as sea level rise and desertification. Combined with other challenges, such as rapid and unplanned urbanization, population growth, poverty, conflict, weak governance, all these factors contribute to increasing disaster risk overall and undermining sustainable development efforts and gains. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction recognizes disaster displacement as an important concern and calls for urgent measures to address it. Preventing, reducing, and addressing disaster displacement should be at the heart of UNDRR and DRR policies and planning processes to reduce future disaster risk and ensure more resilient societies. Yet at present, displacement is insufficiently considered by governments as part of their DRR efforts, particularly at the local level. The tool we are introducing today is one of the latest additions to the Disaster Resilience Scorecard for Cities series, which is a set of tools that UNDRR and its partners have developed under the Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative. These tools aim to help local governments assess disaster resilience and support local DRR planning in line with the Sendai Framework. The Disaster Displacement Addendum to the Scorecard is a self-assessment tool for local governments that supports the integration of disaster displacement considerations into local DRR policies and planning processes. The tool was developed as part of a collaborative, multi-partner effort in consultation with global experts and stakeholders and pilot tested in several countries. I would like to thank all the partners who have supported this process. In particular, the Norwegian Refugee Council, the International Organization for Migration, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, UNDRR regional offices, and all the experts who contributed to the stakeholder consultation and pilot workshops. I would also like to thank the donors who supported the development of this tool, including the German Federal Foreign Office, the IOM Migration Resource Allocation Committee, and the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. We hope that the new Disaster Displacement Addendum to the Scorecard will help to bridge some of the existing gaps in disaster displacement and DRR policy planning and implementation, and contribute to more inclusive and resilient communities. I wish you all an excellent session. Thank you.
Thank you very much to UNDRR for those very comprehensive and relevant introductory remarks that sets the foundation for today's session. With this, I am pleased to hand over to Carla Lienhardt from IOM, who will delve us into the scorecard and facilitation package to give us an idea of what they actually look like and how they can be used. Carla, over to you.
Thank you so much, Marta, and I will share my screen in a second so we can get started with the presentation. I just want to quickly check with the interpreters if the French interpretation is working, because unfortunately I cannot find them to double check if the role assignment has worked. So if you can please confirm or reach out to me bilaterally in the chat so we can figure that out. So I will share my screen now so we can move on. Marta, can you please confirm that you see the presentation in full screen?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So as you already heard in the introductory remarks, the Disaster Displacement Addendum is one of several thematic annexes to the overall City Resilience Scorecard that was launched by UNDRR as part of the Making Cities Resilient initiative. And it's a tool really to empower local governments to better plan for displacement crises and enhance community resilience. Although, of course, you can use it complementary to the overall assessment, it also serves as a standalone tool that can be used independently by local governments or, of course, in collaboration with partners. It's a self-assessment tool that local governments can use to assess their state of capacities, identify strengths, address gaps, and really use it as a tool to inform action to reduce risks related to disaster displacement and support strategies for DRR. Why is it important to integrate disaster displacement into disaster risk reduction planning? Of course, we're making great progress on the front of disaster risk reduction in line with the Sendai framework, but there are still gaps, and disaster displacement is really an escalating issue that we're facing in several different contexts, in either sudden or protracted displacement due to disasters. So we're really, with this tool, trying to promote the integration of disaster displacement issues within wider DRR policies and plans and actions to, first of all, prevent displacement if possible, and where not possible, to better prepare for displacement, ensure that it happens in a dignified manner, to the extent possible, limit how long people are displaced and to limit the challenges that they're facing. And of course, to strengthen the resilience of displaced persons, but also the host communities that are taking in the displaced people. We cannot reduce disaster risk if we do not also reduce the risks that are related to disaster displacement. So we really need to ensure that we integrate disaster displacement throughout the disaster risk management cycle, meaning throughout reduction, preparedness, response, and recovery phases. That can look like preventing situations that may lead to displacement. As I said, disaster preparedness is an important part. So, for example, if we look at early warning systems, to ensure that these early warning systems are inclusive of displaced populations and that internally displaced persons are able to receive early warning messages and have the ability to act accordingly. To strengthen disaster response systems that are inclusive of displaced people and provide basic needs for displaced persons. And regarding disaster recovery, of course, to not only have short-term solutions, but durable solutions for displaced persons and promote equality and inclusion. Now let's look at how the scorecard is structured. The scorecard is basically mirroring the general city resilience scorecard. So if you're familiar with this one, you will see that also the disaster displacement annex is structured around the 10 essentials for making cities resilient. So there are 24 questions or indicators that you score from 0 to 3, where 3 is the maximum possible score. Now, these criteria have been adapted to specifically look at disaster displacement issues across the 10 essentials that we're going to look at in the next slides. So here you can see that we follow the same structure of the overall 10 essentials that look at different angles of capacities, including governance, institutional arrangements, financing, infrastructure, preparedness, recovery. So we look at these areas of capacities and adapt it or tailor it to disaster displacement to assess where are our strengths, where are maybe some gaps, and where can we enhance local resilience and better integrate these issues into DRR strategies. So here you can see the questions for the first 5. And on this slide, the questions of the other essentials. So under each of the 10 essentials, we have a number of questions or indicators that you would score. And I would like to show you one example in a bit more detail. So this is the one essential that's organized to address disaster displacement. So really looking at the governance level of disaster displacement. And you can see in this case that we have 3 questions that relate to this essential or indicators. And if you look at the tool that I think was already mentioned, is of course available online, so everyone can download either the interactive Excel version or the accessible PDF version. And you will see that there's even more detail than you see here in these questions. So for every question, you will have some guidance and explanation. What is the relevance of this question? How can you adapt this to your local context? You will also be prompted to provide means of verification when you assign your score, meaning what is the evidence to score this question. And also you may indicate what are possible actions to achieve a higher degree of resilience, and even able to indicate what could be the respective timescale and also what could be responsible entities to implement these actions. So this is really a tool, not just for the sake of analyzing, but really to prompt action. So here you can see one question in more detail. As you can see, the scoring works from 0 to 3, and you have here the guidance. What does it mean to score 3? In this case, having a comprehensive city plan that directly guides how to address all stages of disaster displacement applied across all departments. And of course, in some cases, it may not be as straightforward what score you should assign. It may require some previous data collection or revision of available policy or planning documents. It may also require some discussion with multiple stakeholders. So these questions are to guide the discussion, and they're basically a conversation starter. But we highly encourage that the local government that is taking the lead in this self-assessment really apply this tool within a multi-stakeholder workshop setting and really get into discussion, including different stakeholders that may contribute to this discussion, including, of course, displaced persons, or if not, organizations that represent their concerns. Now I would like to show you what it looks like if you use the Excel version of the tool. So if you assign the scores throughout the Excel sheet, then at the end you will get automated visualizations of the scoring. And you can download this as a PDF report. So you will have a very nice visualization of what your scoring looks like, where are your strengths, where are some gaps, and use this as the next step to really conduct a planning and prioritization exercise. So, of course, this is very context specific and flexible. We just would like to highlight that this is where this is maybe the most important part, what comes after this assessment, that you really use this discussion and results to identify priority actions. Of course, it is open which kind of tools you would like to use. Here just some examples from the Kenya pilot, where the scorecard was actually used to prepare an action plan. And of course, you can also have an action plan with priority things that you would like to implement that directly link to budget requirements that you can then use for fundraising. And another thing I would like to highlight before I hand back the floor is that it's, of course, not to compare between cities. And I'm realizing that we use the word cities a lot, but of course, this tool is not only for cities, but it's for any type of local setting. So it could be a county, it could be a neighborhood, a rural area or district. It's really very flexible. The only thing important is that it is led by local authorities, whomever that is, and that it's also a multi-stakeholder engagement, ensuring that, all voices are heard, and to really focus on what do we want from this assessment, how can we use the results to improve local DRR planning and implementation. It is also not a one-point exercise. It is really a continuous learning and improvement approach. So although not for comparing between cities, of course, it can be a useful tool for one city, for example, to repeat this exercise in time to see how you are improving in terms of disaster displacement integration in your local planning. And with this, I would end for now the presentation and hand back to Marta. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive and helpful and practical overview of the tool and its different uses. We had dedicated some time for questions and answers here, but I see that there are no questions and answers in the QA section yet. So we will move forward to a presentation by Lorenzo Guadagno from PDD on the practical experience of implementing the scorecard in different pilots at the country level and some next steps going forward as well. And then we will later have another time dedicated for further questions and answers. So this is also just a reminder for participants to please post any questions that you might have in the Q&A section, because we look forward to engaging with them later. With that, I'm handing over to Lorenzo. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, all the colleagues joining us for this webinar. I'm going to share my screen, and I will please ask someone to confirm that you can see the slide coming up.
Yes, confirming. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. I will just very briefly introduce how we got to the presentation of this tool, and then I will hand it over to our speaker from the field today for her perspectives on how this tool has been used concretely. But just to give you a flavor of what's been the genesis of this tool, we had the first version that was developed jointly by the Norwegian Refugee Council and the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, that together with the International Organization for Migration, we at the platform on disaster displacement tested with local authorities in Kenya in 3 locations, in Mombasa, in Kisumu, in Homa Bay. So this was like the very first version that we could bring to the field in order to get feedback from local authorities, from actual end users of this tool on what could be improved. In parallel, the tool was used in Iraq, was used in Trinidad and Tobago, in Brazil, in Guatemala. And from all these implementations, we came back with a number of pointers to actually strengthen the tool, to make it a little bit more relevant for local authorities, for local governments. And throughout 2024, we have been working with a group of experts from different organizations, as well as in partnership with local governments, in order to really redevelop the tool, reshape it, and be ready for a better support to local governments. The outcome of this process has been a beta product that has been tested again in Kenya with the government of the county of Garissa and the city as well of Garissa. And then we went to the launch of this tool, which was presented by UNDRR this past autumn. And then it was presented at the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. Ever since then, we have started actually rolling out the tool. So what you're attending today is kind of a very open global launch of the tool, but the tool has been used in the meanwhile in these past few months. In particular, again, in Kenya, together with the International Organization for Migration, we organized a training of trainers at national level, and then a further follow-up training. And then in the Caribbean, it has been used over the last few months in Antigua and Barbuda, in Barbados, in Jamaica, and we're going to be hearing about that in just a second. And there is a further training or assessment rather that is scheduled with this tool in St. Kitts and Nevis coming up in the coming weeks or month. So it's been 2 years in the making. What you have been receiving through the chat, I believe, in the links that have been shared by colleagues. This is the final product. It's a product that is now ready to be used. It's completely open for a consultation and for use by local authorities, whether in support with the support of these type of actors that have been helping with the development so far, or autonomously as part of, as Carla was saying, ongoing use of the scorecard for city residents, or as a sort of standalone type of assessment as well. So in order to speak a little bit about one of these country level processes and local level processes, I will hand it over to Mrs. Anna Tucker Abrahams, who works in Jamaica's Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management. I think, Anna, you should be able to unmute, and please go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Good morning, everyone. Well, we attended a 3-day workshop in Montego Bay, St. James, where we were first, we were exposed to the addendum, the disaster displacement addendum of the disaster resilience scorecard. And at first, let me just say that the scorecard is user-friendly. And what we've found over the 3 days is that it operates like an audit tool that allows you to identify the issues being faced within the locality, and also plan for future interventions regarding the issues identified. And there's an action plan template that allows you to outline what the financing mechanisms are, what's your targeted timeline for intervention, and who are the responsible partners for that implementation. So it's a grab and go kind of instrument where you can use the action template and adopt that to other plans that you may have for the parish. And I also see the value of it being used at the national level. But let me start now concerning the discussions around displacement. The instrument itself, in terms of the ranking system, and Carla just mentioned, took us through the 10 essentials. How it is designed is that it asks you some probing questions. So it provokes discussion around the issue of displacement, and it also sheds light on some issues you may not have thought of during the discussions. And what I had found during the group, well, it was really group participation. What I found is that engaging as a representative of the ODPM, this is the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management at the national level, engaging with the local authorities and their agency partners within the parish of St. James, it was clear to see how there was linkage to what is happening at the local level and how it influences the planning for disaster risk reduction at the national level. So coming out of the discussions for displacement, we were exposed to the coping mechanisms of the communities, the vulnerable communities within the parish. As you know, because St. James is one of the economic hubs of Montego Bay, is one of the economic hubs for Jamaica, what you find is that there is a urban sprawl. So there's an expansion of informal settlements within the parish, and it's mainly along the coastal areas. And of course, that expansion of informal settlements increases the vulnerability of these households. So in discussing the disaster displacement addendum, we're able to look at how these communities are actually coping in their own way or responding to disaster shocks, and then how those response strategies at the community level can be incorporated to the parish response mechanism. Some of the categories of displacement came out during the discussions. We looked at critical sectors for the parish, mainly tourism and agriculture. So in the northern sections of St. James, this is mainly where the rural areas are. And this agricultural sector supports the primary tourism sector activities on the coastline. So discussions around displacement at the sector level are business continuity plans in place, how many facilities have emergency response plans, how readily are they able to respond and recover to shocks. We also looked at some of the small, medium enterprises within the parish itself and what is the support being given at the municipal level to these enterprises, and also what are our plans at the national level to incorporate SMEs in how we plan for displacement. We also looked at sensitive ecosystems. Of course, we know that the tourism sector relies heavily on the natural environment as a tourism product, and the displacement of not just the built environment, but also the sensitive ecosystems within St. James also came up in the discussion. We also found that some of the ecosystems span parish boundaries, and there is limited discussion across the different parishes or municipal corporations concerning how any disruption of a sensitive ecosystem in one parish will have a domino effect in the other parish or the neighboring parish. So those are things that came out in how the questions of the 10 essentials were structured that kind of guided how we discussed and how we planned for the use of the displacement addendum. Now, in looking at the action plan template itself, the structure, as I said earlier, is very user-friendly. It's a one-page template that can be quickly populated. It is best populated using a multi-stakeholder approach. What we found is that the right persons for that 3-day workshop are at the table. And so we're able to adequately fill in the different sections. It has a section that outlines not just the goal, but the targets. What are the tangible outputs for that target, and what's the time frame? The time frame in the template allows you to indicate whether it's short, medium, or long term, and that is relative to the user of the instrument. I think some users may also indicate the actual number of years. You may say this is a 1-year initiative, 3-year, and for the ODPM at the national level, in our strategic planning process, we use a 4-year cycle, and we see where the action plan template can be incorporated into that and rolled out operationally per annum. So there is room for partnerships to be strengthened between the national disaster risk management framework and the parish mechanism. And the scorecard as a whole, even though for the 3 days we focused mainly on the early warning and displacement, and seeing clearly where all the other addendums of the scorecard can be incorporated into our strategic planning process. So that's something we're looking forward. In terms of our next steps, ODPM, well, let me just say, ODPM will be adopting or adapting components of the disaster resilience scorecard into the work that we do. We see where there is direct alignment in using the scorecard to audit our own internal processes and how we strengthen the DRR interventions at parish level, island-wide. We're going to continue our partnership with the Ministry of Local Government and Community Development in working with the municipal corporations directly to populate the various addendums of the disaster resilience scorecard. And of course, for St. James, one of the priority actions coming out of the 3-day workshop is the updating of the disaster risk management plan for the parish. At present, the plan emphasizes the emergency response components, but of course, given what we learned during the workshop, we're seeing where the disaster risk management plan needs to have a section that addresses displacement and early warning. So that's something we're looking to continue to work with the local government on. Also, in developing the local sustainable development plan for the parish, again, elements of the disaster resilience scorecard can be incorporated into that plan. And of course, this is something that will be standardized across all parishes. We will continue to support the local government in future workshops in exposing key stakeholders to the use of the scorecard. And regarding the resettlement strategy was mentioned earlier. For those who are not aware, there is a preventative resettlement strategy for Jamaica. This was developed in 2014, and it came up during the workshop where we found that the work done in 2014 to develop this strategy is directly aligned to the disaster displacement addendum. And the questions coming out of the 10 essentials are actually connected to elements of the resettlement strategy. I'll just share a few of the components of the strategy. There is a section speaking to how you identify vulnerable communities, whether they are formal or informal, based on their location. Some communities are located on marginal lands. The resettlement strategy outlines procedures for relocating communities post-disaster. So following a shock from a disaster or emergency, what are the strategies? How do you relocate these persons? How do you ensure there's provision of the required amenities in the new locations to sustain the livelihoods of those persons? And these are questions that came up in the disaster displacement addendum. What measures do we have in place to address the needs of displaced households? I attended another workshop after this 3-day one. I attended one concerning migration. And again, I see where the displacement addendum can be applied. We do have migrants in country. We also have internal migration across parishes, and how the displacement, whether the reasons for moving is crime related or disaster shocks, whatever the reasons are for displacement is clear. But we see again here where there is alignment to the disaster displacement addendum. So of course, we'll be using that going forward. We're also looking to strengthen and widen the sensitization around the resettlement strategy for Jamaica. Most stakeholders it was developed using a multi-stakeholder approach, but of course, some are still not aware of how the strategy can be used in their planning. In Jamaica, there is evidence where we have applied, we have vulnerable persons. I'll give you an example. There is a community in Kingston. These settlers are living on the riverbank of the Hope River, and we had a severe weather event. We had a hurricane, I think it was Hurricane Ivan, where many of these households were displaced. And working close with the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation and the Squatter Management Unit, we tried to, and the Ministry of Housing, we worked together to identify lands in Albion, St. Thomas, to relocate persons. So this is another parish, and the parishes, even though the parishes are neighboring, the access to resources differed in that area. And what we found was that the persons that were relocated to Albion St. Thomas eventually went back to live on the marginal lands in Kintyre, Kingston, not just for familiarity, but also because of access to resources. So there are several lessons we're learning in trying to apply the resettlement strategy, where you cannot just move persons and find them new homes, but you have to ensure that the accompanying amenities, also social networks are put in place to ensure that the community is sustainable, and working together to see how we can integrate these persons into an existing community. Because what we found was that the formal Albion settlement or the residents of that community were not as receptive for the entry of these new displaced households. So the whole matter of displacement is a complex issue, and coming out of that 3-day workshop where we were focusing not just on the displacement, but on the early warning messages required and the infrastructure to put in places to help these persons reduce their risk. Those discussions around the scorecard showed us how we can better plan by looking deeper into the complexity of displacement and not just at the surface level. Yes, there's early recovery, but what are the medium and long-term strategies? So in closing, I just want to say that the overall disaster resilience scorecard is a useful instrument, and at present it's being rolled out at the parish level through the local authorities, which is good, but I see where the scorecard can be scaled up at national level to ensure that there's synergy between what the local authorities are planning for their communities and what the ODPM and other key stakeholders of the process can do at national level to support the sectors and also the local authorities. So I'm happy to have been a part of that process, and we look forward to all the further engagements with the Ministry of Local Government and Community Development and other partners, UNDRR. We just want to say thank you from the ODPM. Thank you for the opportunity for just widening our exposure on the use of the scorecard. Over to you, Martha. Thank you.
Actually, Martha, if that's okay for you, I'll just go ahead with it. But just thanking Mrs. Tucker-Abrams for a comprehensive and very detailed account of the process, and perhaps for giving the audience a flavor, both of how the scorecard actually works in practice, but I think also perhaps more interesting of the latitude of topics that end up being relevant to this discussion. And I think this addresses already a few of the comments that we are seeing in the Q&A. There is a lot that can be done through this tool and during these workshops to address the priorities that are actually experienced at local level. And there is a lot of flexibility that can be built into these processes in order to address what communities and local authorities actually care about locally, whether it is the more preparedness side of things, it's more about situations of protracted displacement that the localities has experienced, or perhaps even situations with resettlements and relocations that Ms. Tucker-Abrams was also referring to. In order to perhaps give you a few pointers to some of the main experiences that we have gathered using this tool, I'm going to be sharing again the screen for a few additional slides. And this is really about the main lessons that we have learned working with this tool in these different contexts that were mentioned in the previous slide. So first of all, you probably have seen it already from many of the things that we have discussed so far. But using this tool, you really start a conversation on disaster displacement. You convene a number of people from different sectors, and you start discussing about the relevance of the issue of disaster displacement within their disaster risk reduction planning, for their capacities, for their mandate. This is already, I think, an important first step, because a number of actors at local level, whether coming from different sectors, whether coming from different societal groups, etc., are not necessarily confronted with this issue, or not explicitly, do not explicitly see how their mandate is relevant to preparing for displacement, addressing displacement, or resolving displacement. And it's been mentioned how important it is to have a multi-stakeholder workshop. Well, if you bring together people working on disaster risk management with people working on shelters and housing, on transportation, education, health, all of these will be relevant to the discussion on disaster displacement. And starting to unpack the relevance of the topic locally with all these groups, it's a first step towards understanding what actions are needed and what is actually possible. So you start a conversation, you raise local awareness across all different representatives, and then perhaps even more importantly, you start building a consensus on what's needed. One of the questions that I saw within the group of the Q&A, and perhaps I can start addressing it a little bit, was what to do when there are people that perhaps are not agreeing on some of the scoring or on some of the measures. This is really an opportunity to start building a common understanding and a shared list of priorities. So having people that have different perspectives is actually part of the process, and having people that perhaps come from the government together with people that come from the civil society and the communities of people that are affected and displaced in the context of disasters, it's really a step towards getting better outcomes. In terms of the facilitation, again, this element of the multi-stakeholder participation is fundamental. It's excellent if you can include in this process people at risk, people that have been affected and displaced, organizations that are working with displaced persons. For instance, throughout our experiences with the government of Kenya, we were able to work together with a global network of civil society organizations for disaster reduction to have always a component of civil society actors present in the room. And this is really essential because what we see is that often this component helps keeping ground truthing, right? Whatever the local government feels, whatever the local government prefers to do in some situations. And having this open conversation with civil society representatives is essential, really, to have a broader set of perspectives emerging. It is essential to have a lead for this process, that is someone who is a high-level political figure within the local authority. So this is a tool that is mainly implemented and used at technical level, but having a political leadership and political engagement at the local level is essential to ensure that there is participation in the assessment, that the assessment is part of a local engagement that goes beyond a single event and that can actually support a process. We've seen that there are often issues with terminologies that might not necessarily be clear to everyone, with the differences between, for instance, resettlement, evacuations, displacement, and there is a need to perhaps first build some awareness also of this from a theoretical and conceptual point of view. But once these issues perhaps with language are addressed that are also linked with translation, we see that this is an issue that a lot of colleagues from different sectors have actually experienced or are already working on. So this is not something that ends up being something that is imposed from outside, but in most circumstances is something that is already known and relevant and addressed by local actors. Lastly, in terms also of facilitation, perhaps one thing that you can keep in mind is that this tool can be used in a very flexible manner. In some places, it's been used in a very condensed version over half a day, in others over 1.5 days, in others over 3 days. And the idea is you can take out of the exercise different objectives depending on what you have available, what time is possible to dedicate to an assessment like this. Perhaps it's just an awareness raising tool. Perhaps you manage to finalize the full assessment. Perhaps you manage to add a prioritization exercise. Regardless, it's going to be an exercise that can provide some benefits to different people coming from different sectors. So perhaps the 3 things that you can keep out of our experiences with this tool are, first of all, again, that the local ownership is key. And if you can start a process to actually build engagement with local actors before you go into an assessment, that is probably ideal. There are also training tools and e-learning, some guidance tools that can be used in order to build awareness and capacities in advance of the workshop. Second, and this has been mentioned already, you can use this tool as part of an ongoing process with the broader scorecard for city resilience or as a standalone tool. And again, both these ways of using it have benefits. It's probably easier if the tools of the family of the scorecard are known, if there is already an engagement on disaster risk reduction and capacity assessments that's ongoing. But it's also possible to use this to identify specific measures. Lastly, remember that these assessments cannot be a one-off event. It needs to be the start of a process. So in order to actually make the best use of the assessment and the prioritization, it needs to be followed by an engagement process, by an implementation process, or at the very least, by a fundraising process, whereby whatever priorities are identified at local level can be implemented either directly or there can be at least a timeline for implementation of selected work, so that this does not remain just a document, an assessment that leads just to a document, but it's actually an assessment that leads to action and that leads to capacity building. So I think I can stop here, just flagging that the tool is available. It can be used, and you can absolutely reach out to the organizing group of this webinar, to UNDRR, to IM colleagues, to us at PDD, to get support into either learning more about the tool or perhaps also setting up processes to use it in your respective countries and localities. There are materials that can support quick awareness raising sessions, training of trainers, actual assessments, and especially if you're going through the process of using the broader scorecard or perhaps revising your disaster risk reduction frameworks, capacities, and actions at local level, this can be a very useful tool to use at this stage. This contact information will be shared in chat, but I'm just putting it up online on the screen so that you know that it's in the slides that will be shared after the session, and don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. And now I'll give back the floor to Marta and Carla for the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for these contributions, and to all of our speakers for the very interesting presentations. And thank you, Lorenzo, for already taking some questions as part of your presentation. That was excellent. Now we are proceeding to the dedicated Q&A section. So I will gladly hand over to my colleague Carla, who has selected some questions for live answers by our speakers.
Thank you, Marta. Yeah, it's great to see such high interest from our participants, and many interesting questions in the Q&A and chat. So one question is, what are the most common barriers cities face when integrating disaster displacement strategies into their resilience planning, and how can these be overcome? That's a very loaded question. I don't know if Anna would like to speak to this, as it's more, I guess, directed to you and not us as organizers. Would you like to come in?
Okay, a few barriers based on the discussions we had is how we involve the communities, the actual vulnerable persons that live in these marginal areas. How do you integrate what their role is or what their needs are into the overall planning? So we found that you can't just only apply a top-down approach to disaster displacement. There must be mechanisms for getting feedback, direct feedback from persons who have experienced displacement. And we have at the national level, we have a shelter program. So once there is a disaster, we activate our emergency shelters, and the shelter managers are able to acquire data from the shelterees concerning why they came to this location, what are the triggers, what are the shocks, how are they able to cope. And we have the Social Development Commission, which works directly with communities that can conduct focus group discussions to also tease out some of the information. And ourselves, the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management, we have what is called community disaster risk management groups. And these groups are generally attached to existing community-based organizations within a community. And through the engagement, we're able to tease out the information from those persons. We also work closely with the parish disaster coordinator. So the barrier here is not necessarily knowing what the needs are, but getting the information from the right persons. Instead of making assumptions, we need to just increase the community engagement to ensure that there's more evidence-based research being done into what the issues are surrounding displacement and how we can reduce those risks. I hope that helps in answering the question.
Great, thank you so much. Then I would like to group some questions that were a bit similar. So one, what can we do to ensure that the scorecard is globally applicable while still being locally relevant? And another question was, what mechanisms are in place to ensure that the scorecard remains adaptable to unique challenges of different cities, especially in developing regions? Who would like to take this question? Lorenzo, maybe?
Sure, I can give it a try. So this is indeed quite a concern, I think, with the development of such a global tool. We are starting from the structure of the global city resilience scorecard that UNDRR has developed, with the essentials and with an understanding that we need to tease out for each of these essentials that you've seen in Carlos' presentation before. What are the main indicators that are important for disaster displacement? However, I think the way the questions are formulated, it's broad enough that they allow cities and local authorities to actually steer the discussion towards the areas that are most relevant. Some of the questions on top of that are not mandatory, so they are recommended, but it can be used discretionarily. It's absolutely possible to skip questions. It's possible to focus only on essentials that are of particular relevance for the city. And again, I mean, if you have a look at the question and you see that they are about, you know, whether there is a policy framework or an operational framework locally, what are the coordination systems, what is the data available, they are broad enough that whatever the hazard you're facing, whatever the actual displacement situation you have known in the past, they will be to some extent relevant as a conversation starter. Sometimes it might be a little bit more difficult to score your capacities locally against a certain dimension. Sometimes it might fit better, but the point is that this is not a tool that requires a lot of precision. What really needs to happen through using the tool is that you bring people together, you discuss the issue, and you agree on what are the most important solutions locally. So the scoring is not as important, I would say, as the identification of measures, the prioritization, and perhaps the exchange among participants. And this is something that absolutely remains diverse and adapted to the different experiences of different local authorities, localities, hazard contexts, communities, and so on. I hope that's useful.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Yeah, I think it's really an important point to highlight that the scorecard is so flexible and adaptable to whatever local context. And now I have another question for Anna from the audience, wondering about the associated implementation timeline. So what is the timeline that we're looking at from wanting or having an interest in applying the scorecard to actually running the workshop, and how do you identify the stakeholders at the local level for the implementation of the tool? Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, looking at the interventions that are put forward for the disaster displacement addendum, you're looking at a medium to long-term range for implementation. This is mainly 3 to 5 years. Some of the targets are big ticket items that require funding. For the stakeholders that are engaged, the Ministry of Local Government and Community Development is currently leading this process. ODPEM is one of the key partners of that process, and how they identify the stakeholders is they work closely with the immediate or direct connectors or stakeholders of the municipal corporations. So in each parish, there is a municipal corporation, and you also have a parish disaster coordinator. So the parish disaster coordinator is a link to the community, and the municipal corporations, through their parish emergency operations center and their parish disaster committees that meet monthly, bring together the key players. So all the representatives include the National Works Agency, Social Development Commission, National Water Resource Authority. You have several players that sit on the parish disaster committee, and it's that membership that is targeted mainly for the introduction of the scorecard, or implementation rather, of the scorecard.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question? Because I'm not sure, maybe it was my own misunderstanding, because I had first interpreted the question as the timeline to set up the first workshop. And I think your answer was more about the long term, like to really implement the actions that will follow the engagement, right? Maybe that wasn't the question, but in case, would you also be able to answer that, how long that took you? Thank you.
Well, I must admit, the ODPEM was not the initiator of the process. This was mainly the Ministry of Local Government and Community Development. And I think they started the process last year. So far, they have done addendums in Kingston and St. Andrew, and now St. James. I think the overall introduction of the scorecard was done to all 14 parishes, but in moving forward in this operational period this year into next year, they will continue to have these workshops, but I'm not clear on what the schedule is for the frequency of those workshops. But I know they'll be rolling out the disaster displacement addendum in the other parishes soon. This year, later into this year, into next year.
Thank you so much. And I think Lorenzo also would like to come in on that point, just because, yeah, there was this question on the tools readily available, but what does it take to get organized? Did you want to come in on that point, Lorenzo?
Yes, precisely, and perhaps add a little bit from our experience in Kenya, where we started conversations, say, in May 2023, I think it was, when we started discussing with the representatives from 4 local authorities in Kenya, the introduction of the scorecard. So it took us about, I think, 3 months to get the workshop running, actually, the first one. And the reason for that was that we really wanted to make sure that the political level within each local government is engaged in the process. So it's not enough to just go in and start an assessment, but you actually need to have buy-in from a lead agency, from a lead focal point. And then this person has to support with identification of local participants from all the different sectors, with mobilization of the civil society and non-governmental organizations locally, etc. So the issue then is about the availability of resources. Clearly, the tools are available. Organizing a workshop like this doesn't cost a lot of money. It's really about just bringing people together in a location for 2-3 days. But I think the part that really takes time is this engagement of the political level, so that this is not just a technical exercise, but it's part of a commitment towards building local resilience. Over.
Thank you, Lorenzo. And maybe I can direct another question to you from the chat about someone wondering if the tool integrates anticipatory action, and if yes, how can it link?
Yeah, I mean, I'm taking anticipatory action in the broad sense of all the work that goes on before a disaster, right? To ensure that we prepare, that we have information available for, in particular, in this case, early warning, supporting evacuations, etc. So yes, the tool is very much focused on anticipatory action. And to my experience, the bulk of the responses that are articulated out of these assessments concern preparedness and anticipatory action more broadly. This is really about making sure that there are systems in place to ensure that the local responders, the local system is ready in case displacement happens, that the local community knows what to do, so that the impacts of displacement can be minimized, the duration of displacement can be minimized, and there is an effective preparedness and response system. So part of that is also the availability of finance for this. There is a full essential on finance, and this is an opportunity for discussing instruments, for instance, like forecast-based financing, the availability of funds that can be mobilized rapidly in order to support these early action needs and to be able to better respond to displacement if it happens. So I would really invite you to have a look to the structure and the content of the addendum if you haven't done so, because there are elements concerning the data side, the finance side, the capacity building of responder, the preparedness system that really speak to anticipatory action. Over.
Thank you, Lorenzo. There have been some more questions. One of them, what would be more effective to organize or implement the scorecard at the city level or at the neighborhood level for local DRR planning?
Okay, I'll take a go at that one. I think both approaches would be useful. The tool, though, if in applying it at the community level, you'd have to isolate some essentials because some of the essentials speak mainly to your funding mechanisms. And of course, the community would need to be supported in that area. But I see based on how the questions are structured, it would be good to allow residents to use the ranking system to see how they score the parish or the municipality in supporting them at the community level concerning displacement. I think the questions are mainly geared towards the institutions and not necessarily the community itself. However, in asking them to gain an idea of their perception of how the municipal corporations are supporting them in times of disaster displacement, I think seeing what their scores look like can be used for some comparative analysis and to also guide on how we can better engage the communities and help them based on the findings of the addendum.
Thank you so much. There are also two questions that relate to collecting information and how we can improve access to data on people displaced by disasters. And maybe I can direct this question to Marta, if you would like to say something about the indicators for disaster displacement.
Yes, of course. Actually, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center and IOM have jointly been working to deliver and develop a library of indicators on disaster displacement that specifically target disaster risk reduction actors. So this library of indicators really gives you an indication of which aspects of displacement due to disasters is relevant to monitor, for which purposes, and how can those indicators and that data help guide local decision-making processes and planning. The resource that we have developed on indicators on displacement for DRR actors also includes instructions about what data is needed to report on each of the indicators. So it's really another very useful tool to give a first idea of where to start in terms of disaster displacement data. I think we can also post a link to the indicators library on the chat for your reference.
Yes, I included the link in the chat. Thank you, Marta.
Super.
Okay, let me quickly see if we have time for another question.
I think we have time for one more.
Okay, great. So there's a question if or what policy changes or governance structures are needed at the national or regional level to support cities in implementing the addendum's recommendations.
Perhaps, Carla, I can jump in quickly and maybe
of course.
If there is any other, Marta or others. I think one thing that we have seen is that it is easier to implement some of these follow-up measures if there is a clear attribution of responsibilities across levels of government. So if there is a structure that is supported usually by a policy or by a disaster risk management framework, that attributes responsibility across different levels of government, from the national to the local. And with these responsibilities also attributes resources. So if there is a structure in place like that, then action at the local level is enabled because there are clear mandates and there are clear resources that can be allocated for follow-up. This can happen in different ways. In some countries, displacement is part of disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management policies, laws, or this sort of attribution of powers at different government levels. Other countries actually have nationally owned disaster displacement policies, which are kind of sectoral policies that really spell out all the interventions that are needed before displacement happens in order to minimize it, in order to prepare, and when displacement happens, in order to respond and to address it. And I think either of these can work. The important thing is to have this solid, clear set of instructions. So mandates, responsibilities, budgets, and other resources allocated so that there is a solid base and a clear base on which it is possible to follow up through more operational actions after a capacity assessment like this. Over.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I think because we're running out of time, back to you, Marta.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carla. Yes, indeed, in the interest of protecting everyone's time, we have unfortunately come to the part of the session where we have to thank our speakers, but also our brilliant participants for the fascinating questions and contributions. We really appreciate your active participation in this session today. And also a special thank you to the speakers who have been sharing their experience from the national level, including Anna Tucker-Abrahams for your very interesting contributions. As a quick reminder, this session is recorded, and relevant resources that we have been discussing today will be shared with other participants. In addition, if you do have any further questions specifically, you can contact the email address that we have posted in the chat, which is displacement_scorecard@iom.int. So displacement_scorecard at iom.int. And we hope you found today's webinar both interesting and informative. We certainly very much appreciated being with you, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of the day or evening. And we also look forward to following your work as you take on the implementation of the scorecard at your national and regional context. Thank you very much.